Hi, welcome back to the Change Leader Insight Show. This is the podcast where we explore what it really takes to lead transformation in today's fast moving workplaces. I'm your host, Jessica Crow. I'm also the founder of Apogee and the creator of the art and science of change leadership. And today we're going to talk about why brand matters. And M&A. So if you've ever been through a merger or an acquisition, you know that it is one of the most challenging and often emotional changes an organization can go through. There's structure, there's strategy, and then there's brand. And that's why I'm so excited to have here with me Sue Kirchner. She is the founder of Brand Strong Marketing and the host of the Turbo Branding Show. Sue helps founders and CEOs of thriving businesses ignite growth by leveraging one of their most valuable assets, their brand. She's here to share why brand strategy isn't just a marketing tool, but a powerful lever for transformation. Sue, welcome to Change Leader Insights. So happy to have you here. Tell us a little bit more about who you are and kind of how you got to where you are, and then we'll dive into some of the questions.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me on, Jessica. I'm very excited to be
Yes.
here. And you were a guest on my podcast, and we had such an amazing conversation that I'm excited that we get to continue it here on
Same.
yours. So, let me tell you a little bit about my background. I started out in just marketing communications, worked for Motorola out of school, which was not a huge marketing branding company. But I was fortunate enough that I had grown up overseas in Latin America.
Oh, wow.
So I got to work at Motorola in the cell phone division at exactly the time when it was starting to take off with the flip
Very cool.
phones and things like that. And because I was the only one in the marketing department who spoke Spanish, I got to do everything,
Yeah.
which was wonderful. So marketing communications, trade shows, working with distributors on their marketing and branding and all that kind of great stuff. So that was wonderful. But after about 7 to 8 years, Motorola decided they were going to move their division down to Florida. They're going to have all of their Latin American business out of the Florida office, and I didn't want to do that. So I took my first entrepreneurial venture and started consulting. And I started with helping companies in the U.S. go into Latin America, build their brand, find distributors if that's what they needed, and customers, and grow.
Wow.
But after a while, I had a family and children and didn't want to travel to Latin America that much anymore. And I started to look at, well, what do I really love doing? And it happened to be that a friend of mine at Kellogg had said, hey, we're starting a branding agency. Would you come and work with us? And that's what kind of ignited my love for the brand, the upfront foundational part of the marketing process. So I worked there for a year with her. An ad agency was the owner of that particular, startup. And at the end of the year decided, he was going to stick with marketing and advertising. And so there was 3 of us who then jumped and said, you know what, we could do this ourselves. We're going to start our own brand consulting business. And we did that for a number of years before eventually, people going different directions for personal reasons and things like that. But bottom line, after that happened, I said, you know what, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and build a brand myself and
I
see
love
if
that.
I can do that. So I actually, with having small children and at this point in time when Fast Company and everyone was like, oh, anybody can build an e-commerce store, anybody can sell online and things like that, I decided to take the plunge and do that.
Yeah.
So I learned a tremendous amount about brand building, e-commerce, how to drive traffic to your site online, because as an e-commerce platform, if you have no traffic, you have no business.
Right.
I learned all about content. I learned all about sharing your story and emotional connections online and things like that. So did that business for about 8 years until, unfortunately, Amazon kind of crushed all of the small online retailers. But that's when I said, all right, now I got to reinvent myself one more time. And that's when I started Brand Strong Marketing. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to take everything from my past, roll it into this moment and say, I love the brand strategy piece. And now that the marketplace has kind of gone online and digital, and I've experienced building brands online, I'm going to go ahead and leverage that and move forward. So for about 10 years now, I have been working with brand strong marketing and helping clients that are starting to scale. This is
Mhm.
the market that I absolutely love. It's kind of like between the 1 million all the way up to maybe even 20 million. But these companies are going through opportunities of rapid growth.
Right.
They're going through opportunities of merger and acquisition as a means to get to that growth.
Mhm.
And they found that to attract more customers, to attract the employees to serve those customers, and to attract the capital needed to pay for all of this growth, they need to have their brand story down pat.
Right.
They need to tell people, this is who we are, this is how we're unique, this is where we're going forward, this is our customer base, and here's how we're different from the competition. And that is, in my mind, the most essential part of scaling is being able to articulate all of that. And the brand is the core.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense, and I'm guessing and that this is often an overlooked area, which is why you're here to help.
Yes.
When during M&A, many leaders focus on the operational side of what's happening. So what role does, you kind of alluded to this, but what role does brand play in making the merger feel real and meaningful to employees, customers, investors? How does the brand really, aside from telling the story and making those connections, like what kind of advice are you giving to leaders that are going through that process? How do they really need to dig into the brand piece?
Yeah. So there's a variety. I mean, people, when you think about mergers and acquisitions, as you mentioned, the people side of the merger and acquisition is what's going to make or break the ROI for the
Right.
transaction. And yet it is the piece that is most ignored. Because as you said, people are focusing on, gosh, how's the financial integration? How's the operational integration? What's our IT integration? And things like
Mhm.
that, or what's our products? But they stop concentrating on the customer and they
Mhm.
stop concentrating on the employees during this big transaction because there's so many moving parts. But as you
Mhm.
said, um, there is no bigger change in business than a merger or acquisition when you're trying to bring these two entities together. But the brand can play a huge role for a variety of different reasons. One is as the executive teams are working on the transaction and how is this going to work and where is it growing or going, the brand can serve as kind of the beacon of this is the vision of where we're trying to go. And it can provide clarity and focus for making those integration decisions
Mm.
in terms of, well, which customers are we going to concentrate most on? Which markets are we going to concentrate most on? How are we going to integrate our people? If you focus on the brand and where you want the company to be going, which is why
Mhm.
you're doing this transaction to
Right.
begin with, then it's easier to make strategic decisions. So in that case, the brand can serve as a guide to the executive team throughout this process. The second piece of it is as you know, with any change management
Mhm.
initiative, there has to be communication because without
Right.
communication, how are you going to get buy-in, right?
Right.
And the brand is only as good of any organization is how its people deliver on it, right?
Mhm.
And every employee is a brand ambassador in some way, shape, or form. So they
Right.
need to understand, why are we going through this transaction? Give me the rationale behind it. Give me the vision. Tell me what my place is in this new, bigger, better, supposedly
Right.
organization. Give me that so I can buy into it and hang on to it and help the company move forward after the transition goes. So if organizations aren't communicating, hey, this is what our brand is, this is what our brand is going to be as we merge and assimilate the people, the cultures, the customer base, the products. If they don't communicate that, how do they expect anybody to deliver on it or to follow it,
Right.
right?
Right.
And there's a ton of emotion, like you had alluded to in mergers and acquisitions. The company that's being acquired, they may love their brand. They may have huge loyalty to their brand,
Mhm.
right? And they're sad that it's going away. Or they may even feel that their brand is better than the one of, of,
Right.
of
That does
the
happen,
company
yes.
that they're being acquired. I worked for a steel company a long time ago through their merger and acquisition, and we did focus groups around the country with the customers of the acquired company before the merger
Ah,
to find out how they felt about it and things like that. And one of the hardest things I had to do was come back to the CEO of the acquiring company and say, they have a better brand.
right.
Their
Ooh,
customers are very loyal to the brand. They love this brand. They're very nervous and upset about this upcoming merger and acquisition. And it was difficult to deliver that message, but the CEO understood it, did not change the fact that they were most likely changing the name of the company. However, by doing that due diligence up front to figure out what the customers felt,
mm,
we could honor it. In the
right.
communications, once it came through, is we could talk about the fact that we understand you're loyal to this company. We understand that you've been happy working with them for the past couple of years. We are not changing things. We are not changing who your sales rep is. We are not changing the products that you are currently buying. What we are doing is we are offering a benefit of a larger organization, could lead to better savings, could lead to more product innovation in the future. So, but by honoring it and explaining it, it talked to the emotional tie and
Absolutely.
made made the change decision a little bit easier for people to
To
absorb, right?
process.
And the
Yeah.
other thing too, when you're talking about the branding and you're communicating it to your customers or you're communicating it especially to your employees and the acquired employees as well as your existing employees, is don't just say, hey, here's the brand and here's where we're going. You need to share the stories of what that brand looks like in action, right?
Mm,
So if you could talk about, well, our brand is all about bending over backwards for the customer and delivering the utmost of value. Well, that may mean something at company A and it may mean something completely different at customer B. So
right.
you need to share the stories of how that looks in action. And so that's one of the things with brand training is start communicating it pre deal so that
Mhm.
people understand it. And you can even figure out where maybe someone's going to push back on your vision
Right.
or your brand. And so start communicating that up front. Communicate during the actual transition. And then afterwards, make sure that you're still including brand training consistently in meetings, in annual, company get togethers, in strategic planning meetings, in your onboarding. So anytime you bring on some new employee, let's talk about what the brand is. So
Brand
so
means, yeah.
those are kind of those the things that, some of the tips that I talk about. And then one of the things that you and I talked about on my podcast is with any change management initiative,
Mhm.
you need a steward, right? You need an ambassador. You need
Yes.
someone who's going to lead the change, right? Well, branding needs a leader as well. Usually, the CEO or the founder is the steward of the brand. They're the
Mhm.
ones who need to communicate it, walk the talk, share those stories of what it looks like in action. And the same thing with with the merger and acquisition, the brand can be communicated throughout this very tumultuous time
Right.
of change. They need to really make sure that they are the steward of it, but you can also appoint some brand ambassadors
Right.
around the merger and
Right.
acquisition. So maybe it's leadership from the team that you're acquiring, and maybe it's leaders from your side, and together they become the brand ambassadors that help smooth the transition during the merger and acquisition process, whether it's talking to customers, whether it's talking to employees or shareholders or investors or even vendors and strategic partners. So,
Yeah. Oh, I love that. You've just dropped so many golden nuggets of wisdom. So people who are listening, they're probably, I hope y'all are taking notes because this is great. And I
yeah,
also want to just kind of unpack this, the brand thing a little bit more as it
yeah,
relates to having people talk about. So in change management, in the change management world, there's an understanding that whomever is leading the change or is responsible for change management, we talk about vision a lot and the
okay,
importance of casting the vision and having leaders talk about the vision and telling that story. But what isn't necessarily there, which you're bringing to light, which I think is a missing factor in many cases, is talking about the brand
right,
along with that vision. Because when you're vision casting with the change, right, you're saying, here's how the future could be. It's describing often what the future state looks like with a new process or system or way of thinking and behaving. But there's not as often that tie back to the brand and what that looks like. So I love that you've reinforced that through brand training and all the things that you just mentioned, right? Like that needs to be
Right.
a part of the vision, a part of the story. And I don't think that's happening as often as it needs to. And that's why I think M&A is a challenging experience for so many people going through that.
Right.
And I also love that, you're talking about brand ambassadors and change management. When you're thinking about change champions or change agents, you're really bringing that together, not just people who are going to say, I can, I advocate for this change and I'm going to help steer it forward. They're also talking about what it means from a brand perspective, which is so valuable because you're bringing it all together. That's the anchor, not just where are we going, but the brand is really what does it mean to us and what does that mean for the company. So I really love how you've described all the things that leaders can be thinking about when going through
Mhm.
M&A from a brand perspective, and really how powerful it can be in tying the change management elements that are so critical during a major transformation like that together. So from your perspective then,
Yeah.
what are some of the biggest mistakes an organization can make during a merger as it relates to brand, and what
Yeah.
would you do differently?
Okay. So there's a couple mistakes. So the first one, which I find very interesting that people don't spend a lot of time on, is before the deal, before the merger or the acquisition, there should be a brand audit done on
Mm,
both sides, right?
mm.
And this is kind of what I talked about with the steel company. They
Yeah.
did do that, which was lovely. But I have worked with so many, especially in that space that I play, the small mid-market space, is where they said, "Oh, we acquired this firm because they had such a we felt their brand was so strong and had a great reputation in the marketplace." And then post deal, they find out we were mistaken,
Oh,
that it
yeah.
actually did not have a great brand in the
Oh.
marketplace, that maybe it did at one time, but
Mm,
lately I'm dealing with a current client where they purchased a company, are going to lead that. And they said, well, we purchased it, and part of the deal price was the brand name valuation. And then
mm.
once we got into it, we found out that as the founder of the company we purchased was on his way to selling the company and on his way out, things started to fall apart operationally,
Right.
internally. They started to upset customers. They started to spend less money on important things in order to make the valuation and the numbers of the company look good and
Yeah,
things
I
like
bet
that.
this happens a lot.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, what they were saying is they said, "We don't regret buying the company. What we regret is the extra, valuation that we paid for on the
Right.
brand, and it wasn't
Ooh,
there." So that's the first thing is, and I know M&A deals, a lot of times they go quickly. It's like, "Oh my gosh, here's an opportunity. We need to jump on it." But
right.
take the time to really understand of the firm you're acquiring or merging with, what is their brand equity in the marketplace?
That's
Is
so
there
smart.
loyalty from customers? Does it
Yeah.
mean anything? Right. So that's one mistake that gets made. The second mistake that gets made is, like we talked about, is you ignore the people side of it, and you ignore the emotional ties that people have to the brand, whether it's customers having those ties or whether it's employees having those ties. So communicate, communicate, communicate. Even in large public companies that I've worked with, whenever there's a merger and acquisition deal on the table, you're not allowed to talk about any part of the deal until
Until it's done.
it's done.
Yeah.
And it's the FCC regulates that hugely. However, you can always talk about the brand and the vision. What you were talking about
Mm,
is, where are we going? Why are we doing this? How are we going to be bigger and better after this deal? You can have that communication constantly,
yeah.
before the deal happens. It's not secret. It's not insider trading. Information and things like that. So use the brand as that inspiration point, as that guide,
Got
as
it.
the vision of where we're going. So that's the first thing. And then, like I talked about, communicating internally pre-deal, day one communication is very important. On the
Mhm.
day that the merger and acquisition deal is cemented, this is the other thing people don't miss sometimes is, have you changed your voicemail message? Have you,
Mm,
how are you answering the phone now that you're this new company? Have you changed your website? Have you changed your digital presence that talks about the fact that as of today, we are now a different company?
right.
Another thing that people forget is on that day one, if you are changing the name of the organization, do you need a transition period after day one where you say formerly this company, or where you say
Right.
we were, this is the combination of these two firms. Do you need to avoid any market confusion where you may have a
Yeah.
customer who, oh, I've bought from this firm for years, haven't bought from them from 6 months, but I'm going to call them now to help me with a problem. And they call the number and suddenly it's a different name. And they're like, wait, what happened?
Right.
Where's the company that I used to work for? So you may on your website, even on your voicemail message, for a limited amount of time, depending how often you service your customers, you may need to reference the fact that we were so and so. We are now
Now we
this
are. Yeah.
company. And things like that. So that's another thing too, is you don't want to create confusion in the marketplace by not addressing the fact that some people, if you've changed the name, tell people you changed the name
Right.
from
Right. And
this
let
to
them,
that, and
yeah.
honor that for a specific period of time. We also talked about not naming a champion, a brand ambassador, someone who's
Mhm.
going to kind of keep track of the temperature of the change pre, during, and post merger and acquisition, and sharing stories of, of what's going on. But again, it's in honoring that loss. One of the toughest things I had to do, as you were talking about emotional, is especially for companies that are scaling and growing.
Mhm.
There were two companies coming together in the textile industry, and the one was kind of they'd been around longer, they were bigger. They'd been around for about 75 years. The
Oh,
company was
wow.
started by the CEO's grandfather.
Mhm.
But because they were kind of private label and in the background in the textile industry, their name really had no equity in the marketplace. They wanted to get into retail. So they were acquiring a company that had a very strong retail brand,
Uh-huh.
for buying things. So the hardest thing was to kind of say, well, what are we doing from the branding standpoint, from the naming, and to tell the CEO of the company that I know this is your grandfather's company from 75 years, but one of
Right.
the biggest strategic objectives you told us for this deal was that you want to get into retail. So you
Mhm.
need a recognizable brand, and you're buying this company because they have a recognizable brand. You need to adopt that as your company name. And it
Oh,
was,
wow.
well, we had,
Did that
again,
happen? Did that play out then? Did they do
played
that?
out, but you had to honor. It took several discussions, several meetings. It took talking to some customers and getting backup data to prove
Yeah.
that there was stronger equity in the retail brand that was being acquired. So it was difficult, and it was a lot of emotional conversations. But it was like, you're honoring your grandfather by moving forward. You're honoring your
Oh,
grandfather
yeah.
by building a bigger company, and taking the foundation of what he created and now taking it to the next level. In your history, you can still talk about the name, the old name,
Mhm.
but as of right now, going forward, this is where it's
Almost
at.
like an ego check, and then you're leveraging the power of brand to help make decisions, as you said at the beginning of the
Right.
podcast. That, and coming full circle with the emotional piece too. You've talked about letting people know what's not changing. You've talked about the importance of letting people know what is changing and having
Mhm.
that, linger for some amount of time, whatever makes sense based on how often the organization services its customers. In your experience from that emotional going through the grief of the change, the loss of a name, the all of the changes, and also to your point, sometimes M&A happens rather quickly because there's
Right.
stuff related to the financials and other factors. How much time, I think this is always a question, how much time do we give employees to go through that process of the emotional grief loss? And obviously, there's a higher level of engagement from the people who are leading and guiding through the brand and through the change management efforts. But, you know, I think this is important for leaders to hear because they've been talking about it. It's firsthand for them for quite some time. Then the announcement happens, right? How much time usually does it take, right, for
Yeah.
employees to process that if there's a really strong brand strategy and change management strategy in place?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it could take, depending how strong the brand loyalty is to the name or the company name that's going away, so to speak, or even the processes or the way we do business. Some of the culture might be changing. To see that go away, um, it could take up to a year for that
Mhm.
to fully process and cycle through a normal business year on how does that look in our company and how are we different. In general, though, I would certainly say within 3 to 6 months, you still need to keep talking about it. You need to be
Yes.
honoring it. And exactly to your point, sometimes M&A happens quickly, but at other times, management, the executive team, they've known about this deal for 6 months already, right?
Right.
They've been
Right.
working on it maybe even a year. So they've known about it for a long time. They think everyone is where they're at in the
Right.
process, right? And they're not. Some employees may have just heard about it,
Mhm.
on day one, or they may have heard about it a month before the transaction happens, depending on how secretive, this merger and acquisition deal was. So, but you do need to give honor to the emotional ties. And I would say 3 to 6 months at the very
Mhm.
least is to keep talking about the fact that we've changed. We understand that, loyalty here is how that was brought over to the bigger organization and honoring it and moving forward. But yeah, you can't just expect that everyone's on the same leadership can't expect that everyone's on the same page on the day that the transaction happens in terms of their emotional processing of the fact
Absolutely.
that everything is changing, because it is. The name may be changing, the products mix or service may be changing, who their boss is might be
Right.
changing. The customers may be saying, oh, but I love my sales rep. Is my sales rep going away? And if my sales rep's going away, I don't want to work with you guys anymore because that's the whole
Yeah.
reason I buy from you.
Yeah.
So you need to honor all of these emotional ties, and there may even be emotional ties to brands within a company.
Right.
Meaning I have done some work with private equity roll-ups.
Mhm.
So a private equity firm goes and buys some small mom and pop companies within a particular industry or market or field. They roll them up into a larger company so that they can share, economies of scale and then sell it for a profit.
Mhm.
Well, the issue is sometimes each one of these little mom and pops, especially if they have a consumer or a product brand, they may have all these different brands. Now that you've rolled them up, you may have a mishmash of brands that are overlapping, products
Mhm.
that do the same thing and have different brands, and you might have to look at your brand architecture, or you might have to look at your I call it, the family of brands that you have now required, and make
Mhm.
some tough decisions on, you know what, we bought a company that makes, let's say windshield wiper blades, and we bought another company that makes a different kind of windshield wiper blade. Well, this company's brand is well known in the marketplace. This one is not. So we're going to go ahead and rebrand it as this. Well, the mom and pop founder of that company may be devastated, right?
Right.
They spent all this time, energy, and money building up this product brand. And now all of a sudden you're telling me that you're going to take it away.
Right.
So again, it goes back to communicate why the change is happening, communicate why it's going to be bigger and better for everyone when this change happens. And that should ease a lot of that fear that most people
Yeah.
have in regard to change.
Yeah, and the with the important, doing this well after the day one, right? 3, 6 months, sometimes a year, and
Yep.
I think what I have seen, having been through M&A, and having witnessed it, kind of being on the outside as well, is that that doesn't happen to the extent that it should, right? It's like
Right.
the first month, there's a lot of fanfare, and then everybody goes back to focusing on the technology and the operations and the restructuring and all of that, and the brand story that sort of falls to the wayside. And so you've done an amazing job of articulating why brand is so important during a major transformation like M&A, but also it gets me thinking about all different types of changes that are happening in the workplace and why brand is so important alongside vision and story and helping people understand what's going to be better and how they're impacted. This has been such an illuminating conversation,
Yeah.
and you're so knowledgeable in this space. What are there, any final tips or advice for people who are, in an organization that is either getting acquired or going through M&A, any final tips that you haven't yet shared, or just anything you want to double down on?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely gonna double down on if you can audit the brand you're acquiring
That's
before you
great.
acquire it, please
Yeah,
do so. It could save you a tremendous amount of money, in the purchase price and things like that. And I
very smart.
also would recommend that if you're a company looking to sell, spend some time in building up the equity of your brand because you can get a multiple on your sale price if you can prove the loyalty that you have with your customer base and how
Yeah,
much equity you have in your brand. So that's definitely a big one that I tell business owners is, are you looking to sell in 5 to 10 years? Well, what are you doing to build
right
that
now to
brand up
build up
so
the
that you
brand.
can
Yeah,
add a multiplier to the sales price of your organization. They just
brilliant.
they think about it at 6 months before they're gonna sell it.
And
It's
then
like,
it
"Oh, well,
crud. Yeah.
brands are all about building relationships with people, whether it's your
Mhm,
employees, whether it's your customers, whether it's your strategic partners or vendors. So whenever there's a relationship, you need to treat it as such. You need to
mhm.
honor the strength of the relationship that's there. You need to communicate, and you definitely need to, like you said, give change time to infuse, to settle, to get through that initial gut fear reaction of, oh my gosh, something's changing. I don't like it. It's like, no, calm down.
Yep.
Let's take this. Let me explain. Let me communicate how this is going to work, and what important role you all have in this new company that we are building. And I think
Yeah.
that would help improve ROI tremendously.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, and I can imagine for some of the people who are on the side where they're being bought, they might be checked out, your earlier example, and so stick with it, your
Yes,
brand is important, it can help with the financials, that multiplier, but also people side of the change that's happening. It's so critical to continue to support them in the way that they need to long after the change happens. So it's keeping your head in the game, I guess, pacing yourself, knowing that the
absolutely.
conversation is going to be probably a little longer than maybe thought. So
Yeah.
um
No, and you're
wonderful.
right.
Sue,
Yeah.
yeah. No,
No, I
go
was just
ahead.
gonna
Go ahead. What were you gonna
No, I
say?
was just gonna say, you're right. I mean, executive teams, once they're done with the deal, they're moving on, right? They're
Right.
just like, "Oh, this deal is done. We need to do other things." But yes, honor the fact that it's brand new for
Yeah.
everyone else around the
Yes.
deal and give it time.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Sue, how can people find you if they want to work with you? I know you're on LinkedIn, but what's the best way to get in touch with you outside of LinkedIn?
Absolutely. So you can certainly find me at LinkedIn at Sue Kirchner. I also have website brandstrongmarketing.com, which you can find me there. And I do have a podcast, as we alluded to earlier, the Turbo Branding Show, which you can find on YouTube, on LinkedIn, Spotify, and Apple. And any one of those, you are able to reach out to me. And I would love to have a conversation with anyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the Change Leader Insight Show. It's been so much fun talking to you and learning how brand is such a critical component of a major transformation like M&A. Thanks again. And yeah, good luck with everything. I have no doubt. I hope if you have been listening to this podcast, you have learned a ton like I have. And if your organization is going through the process of M&A or just wants to learn how to leverage brand to improve how organizational change happens in the workplace, reach out to Sue. Thank you so much. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, Sue.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.